Hello and welcome to the Choreosophy Podcast. This is episode 222, Why Your Favorite Music Ed Theory May Be Wrong. Did I get you with the clickbait? I hope so. Filling in the gaps simply refers to a premise that I believe we should consider. I am not here to attack you. That is not what I do here. Here is the premise I think we should consider. Number one, no theory of anything, really, of complex nature, gets everything right. I would love it if someone would try to disagree with me on that. Number two, all good theories get something right, or else we wouldn't really consider them a good theory, and no one else would either. So you might think the theory is dumb, but if a whole lot of people use it and find it useful, then that means that theory is probably getting something right that you don't see. And the third part of the premise is that we should be focused on filling in the gaps between all of those disparate theories in music education. And as I've been saying on this show forever, we should also be looking outside of music education for information on the human brain, the human body, all of the things that we are involved in that maybe people outside of our profession see differently than we do. Let's dive in this way. Are you a Gordon MLT devotee? A Kodály-guy? A Tonic Solfa Curwenator? How about a Takadimician? I could do this all day. I think all of those frameworks are wrong, but they're also right. And that's kind of the point of this episode and this presentation. In addition to these concepts, you will get a rare peek behind the scenes later in the episode of what it's like to create a show like this where I say controversial things to start conversations. Because part of the point of this episode is that I do believe that in order to move the profession forward, we have to have conversations, including with people who we disagree with, not just about the political stuff, but about how we teach music. And it needs to become okay to hear someone say, hey, the way that I teach music directly contradicts the way you teach music. And I think that there actually could be some right and wrong to discuss here. And then I also think that there could be some right in this situation and wrong in this other situation, but right in my situation and wrong in yours, etc. There is actually room for all of that. So recently I had some time and a privilege to share some thoughts with a meeting of the Kodaly Educators of Texas at Magnolia High School. You heard episode 219 already from that weekend, but I did a lot of presenting that weekend and shared a lot of information, so I've got a can full of information to share with you as well. So shout out again to Thea Persinger for the invite down there, and I can also come to where you are and do presentations like this. You just need to reach out and ask. So this is the audio and video version of some excerpts from my Filling in the Gaps presentation. I believe that most popular music education theories were generated at a time when you had to be talented or rich to get the music education. So that's a bad experimental model, right? If especially our current goals are different and more inclusive than that. We know a whole lot more than we used to know. And if you have not heard episode 219 and episode 220 with Dr. Anita Collins, those are linked in the show notes to this episode so you can kind of get caught up on all of this conversation. So I hope you tune in and have your thinking stimulated and challenged. And then, of course, when you disagree with me, not if, when you disagree with me, weigh in yourself over on the Choreosopher's Facebook page or on the Substack, choreosophy.substack.com. And of course, don't forget to grab a reading rope for your classroom wall from the Choreosophy shop. Links to all this stuff is in the show notes. Attention event organizers. Ludus is here to take your events to the next level. Imagine a ticketing platform that's not just about tickets. Ludus offers marketing, fundraising, and even volunteer management, all in one place. It's time to streamline your event management process and impress your attendees. Join the Ludus family today and unlock endless possibilities for your events. Go to ludus.com/Choreosophy and try it out now, free to you. And if you use that link, you'll get the marketing feature free to your customers as well. Underwriting and crucial support for this show comes from listeners themselves who choose to subscribe on Patreon or now on Substack. Subscribers get access to the private podcast feed as well as my Google folder full of goodies and much more. The producers on Patreon are Brian Long, Venture Studios, Jonah Clixbull, Angie Schilling, Danelle Eckert, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kakacek. Oh my goodness. All right, well this will be fun. I'm going to start out just by kind of talking a little bit about why I'm here and what I'm hoping that we can kind of pull out of this afternoon. So You guys are members of a Kodály organization, so I'm assuming that means that you've done Kodály training.
Actually, I haven't done Kodály training.
We can
You
have
have.
like when we submit it out, anybody can come.
Anybody can come. Okay, Kodály training, informally. I've had zero. None ever. Yep, but what I've started to realize over the last few years, mostly through podcasting about music education stuff, is that I keep getting comments from people. So you do Kodály training, right? No. There's just like a lot of similarities between the way I approach music education and what Kodály said, and what Kodály training oftentimes has built into it. And so what I've just been discovering is that people assume that I have because of the things that I talk about. And so this is kind of it brings us to Thea inviting me here. I think it's what I'm really interested in right now is this. The idea that no music theory of education is going to get it all right, especially one that was originated, 150 years ago or whatever. They're gonna miss something, and I think, hello, welcome. Is this the person you were talking about? Okay, great, welcome. And your name is?
Maya Noble.
Maya, welcome. I'm Chris. And so I think that this is just an interesting thing for us to dig into. So of course there's lots of music educational theories. You've got Kodály, you've got music learning theory, you've got Curwen, there's Dalcroze and Orff and all the different things. And the way I've been thinking about it a lot recently is that I bet you there's something in all of those that gets it right. But I bet you there's also something in all of those that gets something important wrong. And so the presentation that I have built for us today is called Filling in the Gaps, for that reason, to try to figure out what it is that some of them might be missing, and of course to encourage folks to not necessarily attach all of their horses to the same wagon with everything that they do. Well, I went to a Kodály training and that said it was the wrong way to do it, so I'm not doing it that way because of what I learned at that training. I think really the better approach is to try to synthesize things. And of course then there's an element of like what works for my kids, what works in my environment, what works if I only see kids for 30 minutes every 3 days, all those things. You guys know all these things. Okay, I'm going to bump it ahead now. So this is kind of what I was hinting at a second ago. When Kodály did his stuff, we've learned a lot about the human brain since then. A lot. And so to take his ideas, which I think he did have a lot of things right intuitively, but there's evidence now related to how a human reads, for example, that we did not have access to. We couldn't hook up a kid's brain to an MRI and have them play the piano. Like those types of things. He did not have access to that information. And then of course in the interim, you all know, again, I'm preaching to the choir here, but a lot of barriers have been placed between educators and music students in that amount of time. So I think this one's a really important one, and I would say I probably get, this is probably the source of most of the confusion that I come across when I communicate about these ideas in front of large audiences of podcast listeners, is that most of music education prior to, say, I would even say like 1950s or 1960s in the United States, most music education that has ever been tried has only been tried on the wealthiest elite people and the kids who pre-selected for musical aptitude. Which means that nobody has done the research on the way we teach in the United States, which is anybody who lives in our zip code who wants to take music. That is a huge difference. So for example, if you're taking ideas like, kids really should just all learn fixed do so that they can learn intervals and just memorize what perfect fourths sound like in all contexts. Like, okay, if you're a piano student who's been pre-selected for your piano playing ability and you were raised in China from the age of 4 playing the piano all day long, then sure, I'd buy that. But if you're a 14-year-old adolescent boy who has never taken a music class before and you show up at choir, for your first experience at formal music training, and you have no concept in your mind of what a perfect fourth is or sounds like, then you need something else. You need something that's more concrete that you can learn to memorize in a relatively small amount of time that represents a perfect fourth. If you're a solfege person, you'd call it do-fa, or so-do, or whatever it is in that context, and they also need that context, which is why the typical music student can't just say, well, what does a perfect fourth sound like? Because do-fa exists in different musical contexts than so-do does, and they need the context. They need to hear, oh, we're at a phrase ending, then the so-do becomes intuitive, right? But if they're at the beginning of a song and then they might pull out the Here Comes the Bride as context, right? They have that context in their head. So these things are really important, and they oftentimes are missed details because we've got these barriers that have been placed between students and opportunities to have music education. And we now have to figure out what about all of these theories works in our modern context, in the American context. And it's also true that American music educators oftentimes forget how weird we are. It is still true to this day, actually, that in the UK, you very well might be a kid who never gets music education unless you go to one of the choir schools, which means that your parents have money or you pre-selected, like you auditioned and showed some kind of musical aptitude at age 8 or 9 or whatever. And so the way I've been liking to say it lately is that any system that we choose to teach kids with will work if you pre-select your students for musical aptitude. So if we're using that as our evidence that the system works, that's a pretty poor scientific approach, in my opinion. All right, let's go on to the next one. So in this first, pardon the ADD of my slides colors. I tried to keep them thematic. And also I made this slide presentation on a Mac and then had to send it over, so I lost some of the pretty, there had like some waves and stuff. So I'm just gonna take us through a very simple bullet point comparison of some of these ideas. And I think we can ignore that link for now though, Thea, so we can go ahead and go on to the next one. Come back to it if we need it.
I mean, since the concept is filling the gaps, right? I mean, that's and Chris is right on when I think you say they're like yes and no's to everyone. Entrainment, which is that keeping children, 2 years old or keeping a steady beat. That's where I feel like Kodály, although it's there in the singing, there's not like an intense entrainment of like steady beat.
Okay, so I have a thought about that because I think part of that is the barrier thing that I mentioned before that's systemic in the way we deliver education in the United States. So there are reasons why most people, if you talk about Kodály to most people who are music educators, they think elementary school. Right. There's a reason that that's the case because oftentimes elementary school teachers in the United States don't see kids in enough time to actually reach mastery, like to reach mastery of any type of particular skill. And if they do get a performance opportunity, let's call it a choir in elementary school, we'll call it a choir, they oftentimes get an hour before school or an hour after school. And so then it's suddenly a performance-only focus. We just got to get the kids to know the song in whatever way. So what ends up happening is that there never seems to be a way of connecting the skills in the Kodály method to the actual performance in a sequential thing that we then see as high school teachers when they arrive, right? And that's that disconnect. That's we've got all these theories that are good in theory, but without the time to actually implement them until the kids can master them, then we're in trouble. Let's because I think we're going to get some more of these ideas coming out in the next couple slides too. So let's keep going. And then there's Edwin Gordon's music learning theory, which, full disclosure, is my favorite of them because I think it gets at a lot of things. Of course, now Gordon had the benefit of looking back at Kodály and taking some of the things that he thought was right about what Kodály did. Kodály didn't have that advantage, so it's not a personal slight against Zoltan. Blessed be his name. So in music learning theory, the main concept, the main tenet is that we are teaching kids to audiate, which means that we are teaching kids to hear music in their head but not just to hear music in their head, but be able to understand what they heard and describe what they heard, and then of course recreate what they heard. So audiation in its full glory is basically the ability to hear something that's external and say to you, oh, I just heard so mi, or I just heard do re mi. But then also they could see it on a piece of paper and recognize that it says do re mi, but then they hear that happening in their head and then they can sing it with almost no stress at all because they hear it so clearly in their head. That's the educational goal, the focus of audiation. Now, in a lot of Kodály stuff, that ends up being the result anyway if it's being taught really methodically and well. Sequential learning, very much like Kodály, so things should be taught in sequence. Emphasizes tonal and rhythmic patterns. So for example, a lot of our high school and middle school choirs it's very common across the country. We'll see groups doing things like do, re, mi, re, right? And we oftentimes use them as warm-ups and then never talk to the kids about why they're learning it, right? Like, why do we do that exercise? Well, we're trying to memorize the patterns. We're trying to internalize the ability to hear very, very quickly those patterns. And also one of the things that oftentimes we miss is we miss explaining to kids that, oh, by the way, that is also how you learn to speak English. And that was foreshadowing. Okay. Variety of tonalities and meters, which is, oh, and I forgot to mention that we didn't talk much about the folk songs one on Kodály's slide. That's one of the ones that I would say is the emphasis on folk music in the Kodály method is probably, it's just my opinion, but probably outdated. And the reason for that is just because Americans don't know folk songs anymore. So his whole approach was, let's take that sound before sight concept, because I know that these kids are going to know these songs already. So they're going to come in and they're going to all know that a set of songs. They're going to be the songs that all Latvian kids know, or the songs that all Estonian kids know, or and we just don't, at least not in the United States, we no longer have that. Like that, even in my childhood, we kind of did, but not so much anymore. So the variety of tonalities and meters that Gordon brings in is really more about a literacy tool. It doesn't matter what the music sounds like. We want to be able to put it in front of kids and have them understand the language. Focus on music cognition development, and that's probably the part about it that attracts me to this method in particular. Okay, let's look at the next one. And then I threw Curwen on the list for today's discussion as a comparison because Curwen was really an idea that was developed more as a practical tool. I'm skipping down to number 5, for adult singers, believe it or not. So it's Curwen would have been something that you would think about using in like a church choir, or you'd use in a congregational setting in church. The goal is not to teach people to learn how to read music in all contexts. The goal is to get the music in church to happen. All right, so that kind of changes the approach, but there are some similarities. So movable do with solfege and hand signs is still part of the deal. Focus on sight singing, but not sight singing in an educational context, not sight singing for the purpose of being able to analyze and describe what we just sang and to listen for the intricacies. It's, again, to get the hymns to happen or whatever, or to get the choir to sing quickly. Developed for choirs and congregational singing, less emphasis on music literacy, and I think what that just means is that it's less emphasis on how does this skill transfer to other musical things that they might need to do, which is why it's not one of my favorites. All right, let's go to the next one.
Are you a director new to the profession? Or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com. Don't forget, it pays to listen to this show if you are a music educator. The list of discounts and benefits for listeners just keeps growing, so your checklist for back to school means getting your sheet music at graphitepublishing.com or endeavormusicpublishing.com, sight reading materials from sightreadingfactory.com along with your student memberships every time you renew, choir folders and other classroom materials from mymusicfolders.com, and now, most recently, your Subplans, your ready-made activities and assessments related to music theory can be generated for you with your 3minutetheory.com membership. All of these great vendors accept the Coreosophy discount code. When you check out, you're going to get money saved for your program that helps you take your school year farther. So make sure you hit all of those websites, and it supports this show. So this next few slides is actually going to take some of those theories and cross-reference them. So to the different ones. So similarities between Kodaly and MLT is the sequential, like I mentioned before, that singing is the foundation, that is a similarity. Focus on audiation and inner hearing, the use of solfege, and developmentally appropriate teaching. In other words, thinking about what is the kid prepared for before we ask them to do certain things. I'll say too, on this one, the focus on audiation and inner hearing I think is quite different. They both, I said this before, but they both do exist in Kodaly and music learning theory, but in Kodaly is kind of an afterthought. It's a thing that will happen. Whereas with Gordon, he was it was a really big deal to him to teach kids for that reason. And in my teaching practice, in my main job, which is teaching choir 9 through 12, I will say that I've found that to be probably the most important thing that I teach, is just getting kids to hear music in their head. Because what it ends up doing is it of course makes them better readers, but it also makes them better singers. And it can be a very simple explanation, but let's say I'm sitting in a choir and the conductor is going like this and giving a beat, giving a breath to sing, and I'm hearing the song. Like I hear it, like I'm hearing the song really, really easily in my head. I'm going to sing with no hesitation. I'm going to sing by sending air through my instrument. I'm going to sing confidently. But if I don't hear the song happening in my head, I'm going to go and wait for somebody around me to sing it, and then I'll try to add sound. And then that actually it's a music literacy impact, but it's also a vocal technique impact, and it's a double whammy when they don't hear the music in their head, which is why at my school we talk so much about the idea that either you know the song or you don't know it because your neighbor knows it, because you're copying after their paper. That's what you're doing. That's no different than in math when you go like that and say, oh yeah, I knew the answer, right? And so we do a lot of exercises in class to reinforce that concept. For example, singing staccato is one that I really, really like for that purpose, because it snatches the wig off of every kid in there who does not know how to, like exactly when to sing and exactly what pitch to sing. And then I tell the kids that if we can't do the staccato exercise, we don't know the song. You might think you know the song, but you don't. So those inner ear things, I think, are the most important thing that we're probably going to get out of all of these theories when they get synthesized. Okay, let's try the next one. So Kodaly versus Curwen. Yes, they use hand signs. They focus on singing as the foundation. They still use solfege. Practical for choirs. In number 4 there, I struggle with that because practical is not always best. And I get into a lot of tiffs with educators about this. Well, I choose this method because it's easier. And then I might say something back like, but I choose this method because it's harder. And it forces an analysis. It forces the kid to have to think, right? So the certain things about Curwen are designed to make the singing happen faster, but then to be able to avoid analysis. And for example, I know that I am in the land here in Texas, in the land of law-based minor, but I will talk about why I don't do law-based minor. Because I want my kids to be forced to know that we have just changed to a minor key. So at my school, from the beginning of grade 9, the first day of school, we rehearse entirely a cappella. We never play notes for kids, ever. And so what I've discovered, I've been teaching 22 years, I'm probably 12 to 13 years or so into that, because I grew up the way everybody grew up, with somebody sitting at the piano just playing all the notes while we tried to learn them. And so I started teaching that way, because I didn't know any better. And then what I've discovered is since that time, it's gotten to the point where it would be very strange in my high school choir program if we didn't have 2 to 4 kids with perfect pitch all the time. Yeah. All the time. And because what I'm learning about that a cappella rehearsing system is that kids that have perfect pitch but don't know it never discover it if the piano is always playing the note anyway.
That's right.
Because they don't have to exercise that part of the brain. And so my students, I've had colleagues call me a liar because that's too many kids with perfect pitch. That's too rare. Like, there's no way that you have two to three or four every year that have perfect pitch. Like, well, I do. And what I've discovered too is because they learn it about themselves really early in that process, because we're always a cappella, and then adding that solfege as their tool is super helpful for them, not because they need to hear the pitch, but because it helps them tune things. Because I've heard, one thing I have noticed about people with perfect pitch is oftentimes they will have a version of a pitch in their head, but it isn't always the one that is best in that context. And so solfege helps them tweak the vowel a little bit so that it really tunes, like with everybody else. And so of course, vowel and pitch are connected. So very, very interesting stuff. The tools for pitch recognition, though, for the rest of us mortals, does become the topic of the rest of the conversation. Let's go on to the next one. All right, so some big differences on our three just sample theories today. Kodály emphasizes folk music. I've already mentioned I think that might be a little bit out of date, although I think there are ways to substitute folk music for modern pop music, which I think is very helpful, especially in the elementary context, if what we're just trying to do is get them to make noises that are on pitch. Then that can be the substitute for the modern times. Cultural relevance, which, keeping in mind that the cultural relevance for Kodály was the folk music of the time. So, and I think I've seen elementary school music educators get stuck in that because they learned it in a Kodály training, that you got to use folk songs. So here they are singing, like a George Gershwin song with their elementary school students that were born in 2015. And well, it's culturally relevant because it's like we learned it's got to be folk music. Well, but who's folk music? Right? The whole point, the whole thing Kodály was trying to point out was we should use the songs that are already in their head so that they can take that audio library of noise that they already have and apply it to learning to read the music. But that doesn't work if the song's not in their head. So you defeat the purpose if you teach them a folk song that they've never heard before and then use that as their audio library. That we've just made it harder for ourselves. So of course we've got to use the music that they know. Deep music literacy, which music learning theory also likes to think of itself as. Music learning theory focus on audiation, cognition, pattern learning, and then Curwen is more of that practical approach, less comprehensive, focused on just getting the choir to sing, getting them to make noise. Okay, but then what I'm mostly going to be talking to us about today is the gap that I think they all miss. And this is why this is what probably gets me in the most trouble, because I really think that there is one part of all of this that nobody's talking about except for me. And that is that students read music the way that humans read. So the gap for all those music learning theories is actually a non-music theory completely, which is all the things we've learned in the last 30 or 40 years about cognitive science related to reading. So what I believe we should be doing as a profession is taking all those really good ideas that Gordon came up with and Kodály came up with and whoever else we like the theory of, and then checking them against the science of reading to see if what goes on in the brain for reading other languages can also apply to what we are learning when we teach kids to read music. In order to do that, this also gets me in trouble, students must read alone. Because if they're reading only in groups, then they're copying off of each other's papers. And we might think they're reading, but at the brain level, they very well could be not reading at all. They need time to sound out the music. In the same way that elementary school students need the time to sound out letter combinations, students of music need the time with their voice to sound out pitch relationships and rhythmic relationships. And they need to have the opportunity to get it wrong so that they can then figure out the distance. So for example, if we're trying to get a 7-year-old even to sing do, re, and at sight, and they've practiced do, re in class, and they see it on a piece of paper, and they sing do, re. So then, that needs to be, number one, recognized as partially correct, rather than wrong. That was do, re, but is that what the do, re sounds like that we learned in class? No. So close your eyes, Sing the do-re like we sing in class when we do the warm-up. Do-re. Okay, now do you see it on the paper? Now can you make it sound like that? Do-re. Right? And they need that time. They need that time, especially the ones that don't have perfect pitch. They need the time to sound it out because it's not just in their brain that they're working. It's actually in the muscles of the voice. So we all know the terrible twos. Right? What are the terrible twos? What are they? Do anybody know why they happen?
They want what they want. They also don't necessarily have the communication skills.
There you go.
To be able to tell us what they want.
Yep. So the leading theory on the terrible twos is that by age 2, humans already understand their native language in their head, and they are already thinking in their native language. But the muscles of the mouth and the vocal folds and the larynx and all the things that have to learn to coordinate to say those things have not yet developed. And so that's at their most frustrated because they can think, I want birthday cake. They can think it that articulately, but they can't get their mouth to say it. And I identify with that because, of course, if I would do the same thing. If I suddenly, even as an adult, I would be so frustrated if I couldn't just say the thing that I so badly want. And so what sometimes we miss for our music students is that they are going to go through that too because music is a different language for them. It's a new language and they're going to need some time to sound out and coordinate the muscles because, of course, singing, as our foundation, singing is even more complex muscularly than spoken language is because now we also have to think about like how much air does it take an adolescent soprano to go through her passaggio into her upper register and accurately sing the high A, right? It's not just a question of reading at that point. It's a question of muscle coordination and all of those things. And they need to be explicitly taught all these things. We can't just hope that they will figure it out.
So as I said, that was an excerpt from the presentation that I gave for the Kodály teachers there in Texas. If you would like to hear the entire presentation, including see all the slides that I gathered and information for the rest of that presentation, you can head over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/choralosophy, or become a paid subscriber on Substack. You now have 2 ways to access all of my supplemental materials, which actually is a really nice segue into the next portion of this episode that I thought I would discuss with folks here on the main podcast feed a little bit more about what it is like to do this show and why I do it in all of its complexity. But of course, for the sake of the podcast and timeliness, I will try to keep it short. So, if you are new to listening to the Choralosophy podcast, one thing you may or may not know is that in 2019, in February, I started this show, and I launched the show with the idea in mind from the very, very beginning that I was going to create free, public, out in the open, professional development resources for colleagues, focusing mostly at the time, in my mind, on the nitty-gritty pedagogical things for teaching choral music primarily, or music education in general. That was my thought. Now, from the very beginning, I wanted to create free resources, and I do, by the hundreds of hours so far. But I also thought from the very beginning that if I'm going to put this much time and energy into creating a regular platform that creates these resources for people, I'm going to need to do it as a job. In fact, I had just lost a very lucratively paying church job right before that, and this was my backup plan. This show was my replacement idea for church music. Now, I am since doing church music again, and I'm really enjoying it, but it's a much lower commitment than the job I had back in 2018 and prior to that. So I decided that I would launch this show with absolutely no corporate backing and absolutely no financial guarantee that anything would come out of it. Okay, so the first thing I would ask you is to consider, if you're listening to this show on a regular basis, would I do that? Would I make a commitment to my entire, ecosystem of colleagues that I was going to dive into this thing and I was going to create resources indefinitely? Because that's essentially what I did. When I came out, I said that we are here to stay. I am doing this. I am going all out at this. And would you be willing to make that commitment, knowing I might not get paid a dime for this? I think most people would not. Okay? And ultimately, I believe that is why this show has thrived
for nearing 6 years. And in the digital landscape, the digital world, 6 years is an eternity. And we have been able to keep it going. Okay. Now, of course, one of the ways that we keep it going is the folks over at Patreon, and you heard about them earlier in the episode, and now paid subscribers who opt in. All the resources almost all the posts that go onto the Substack are free. But you can opt in to a paid version, which mostly just gets you access to the stuff the Patreon folks have been having for quite a while. Substack's just a newer platform, so it was a way for me to give people an option. When you're over there, you are chipping in money voluntarily to keep this show going, because that is a revenue source for me. When you use your checkout codes, your Choreolosophy checkout code at Sight Reading Factory and the sheet music companies that I discuss here, and with your My Music folders and with 3 Minute Theory, all that kicks back to me as well financially. So those are the ways that I have set up a way to, for me personally, to make this a job, because that's what it's for. It's for me to win-win. That's how I think of it. If I can create free stuff that moves the profession forward in a way that is benefiting people, and I can support my family doing that, then I really, really am proud of that. And I'm very, very proud of that. And so one interesting experience that I had this last week was that I had a colleague on a Facebook group decide that it would be a really good time to jump in and criticize me for leaving links to episodes in the discussion group that was related to high school choir teaching in this case. Of course, you will find me in a lot of Facebook groups, and I'll explain that a little bit in a second. But in this particular group was geared towards high school music teachers, and somebody had asked for some advice. Well, in my case, as somebody who's been creating content on pedagogical concepts and much more, of course, for almost 6 years, almost every time there is a question, a concrete question about teaching, I've probably created a resource for it already. So one of my business practices is that I will go in and I will simply drop a link and say, hey, I've got a resource that addresses this question exactly. Let me know if this helps, or I hope this helps. And most importantly, if you find something here of value, let me know what you think, because I want to help more people see this, right? Of course, that is my business model, but also it is a genuine desire to help you, the audience member, right? And I think what's very odd to me sometimes, and this is a minority of colleagues, but because the majority of colleagues seem very, very appreciative that this resource is here, but some people see it as you can't really have both motivations. You either are here to just make money and plug your business, or if you really cared, you would just sit down and type out all those tips to help the teacher that's asking the question. And in this case, that was the comment. It's like, why leave a link? If you really want to help, you could just type out your tips. So, of course, in my response to that person, I said, well, the problem is I've already taken my time to make the resource. Why would I take another batch of time to say the same stuff that I've already said in this video? In this case, it was actually one of my most popular short videos, the How to Make Your Kids Sing Louder video. It was a car thought where I had listed out some concrete steps and some tips and demonstrations in that episode, which is more popular. Most of my episodes, by the way, if you go to YouTube, you're going to see a fraction of the audience, because the vast majority of you are listening audio only. And I'm trying to convince more people to go over to YouTube because of how many presentations I've been doing over the last couple of years that have a visual component, but ultimately most of you are just listening. And so that episode reached thousands and thousands of colleagues through either YouTube and or the audio version. So here's how I look at this. That benefits me, obviously, because I have advertisers here that would really like to just grab a moment of your time, which I think is actually pretty fair for the content that you're getting here. They want to pay me to get a little bit of your time, okay, the 30 seconds that their ad runs or whatever it is, okay. In exchange, thousands and thousands of people then are trying some of those tips from that little 17-minute long Car Thoughts episode, right? So here's essentially the reason I'm sharing this with you on the main podcast feed is because I'm not really a believer in in brushing things under the rug. I think if there are people in the audience that are rubbed the wrong way, I imagine they're not in the audience for very long. But if there are colleagues that are rubbed the wrong way by the way that I promote the show, I would only point out to you that there are in the amount of time I've done this show, there are probably, 50 to 100 choir podcasts that have popped up and then popped away. They don't stay. Because ultimately, in order for me to keep this going, I do actually have to go into those Facebook pages and drop links. That is how I keep the show relevant. I keep it in people's feeds. I pay Anna to create content on the Instagram and on the Facebook and all the posts that you see. I invest time and money in making sure that this show stays relevant, because if it stops being relevant, then I have to go get a bigger church job and continue to support my family. So if we want this show to continue, people are going to have to tolerate me showing up in those groups to start conversations, to respond to people, to drop links, and sometimes to stir the pot. Because it is a strategy for marketing, but also it is a genuine belief. It is both. It is a genuine belief that it is for the benefit of the profession. So that's a little bit of a story. If you want to find more about that conversation that I just discussed, I didn't go very into detail, but that conversation was very strange. And you can find some screenshots with the names protected, which is also one of my policies here. If I discuss a thing that is not positive about a colleague, their names are not going to be dragged. Okay, that is not the kind of arguer I am. I would love to argue various points, but I don't want to drag anybody either. I'm not interested in that. So you can see in the Choirolophers Facebook page, you can see some of the stuff that I deal with. Most of the time, I deal with that kind of stuff from colleagues who don't think it's think it's uncouth that I am promoting for financial gain all of these ideas. There are some directors and teachers who really think that we should all just be giving freely to each other at all times, which I think there's a place for that. But ultimately, the really high quality stuff, people are willing to invest time and money, and our time and money as educators is just as important as anyone else's. So that's the concept that I'm discussing here. Go over to the Facebook page, Choirolophers. You can read more about it and also leave your thoughts from this discussion as well. I'm happy to hear more about what you think, because again, that is the purpose of this show, is to drive the conversation forward. So thanks for listening to this little behind the scenes. I hope this was interesting to some people. And again, if it's whetting your appetite to hear more about the filling in the gaps concept, head over to Patreon, become a subscriber. It's really not going to kill you to go in at $3 a month, or even $8 over on Substack. $3 a month is the minimum at Patreon, $8 is the minimum at Substack. It's not going to kill you, but it sure would help me continue this forever. So consider that. Thank you as always for sticking around to the end of an episode. If you are still listening, that means you're one of the people who are MVPs of the Choirolosophy podcast, the people who stick around to the end. Of course, the ways to help are to use the Choirolosophy promo code at sightreadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, 3minutetheory.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com, graphitepublishing.com, and of course you can join the Patreon. Link is in the show notes. You can also subscribe at Substack and chip in a few dollars a month there. All of those things are great ways to help, and of course like, share, leave comments, be part of the conversation. That's what this is all about. See you guys next time.